Hello, welcome. I'm Victoria Liu, and I'm honored to be joined today by author and leadership expert Anne Chow as part of the September edition of Asia Society's Global Talent Speaker Series. Anne Chow is the former CEO of AT&T Business and the first Asian woman to have the CEO position in the company's 140-year-old history. She's also the author of the new book, Lead Bigger: The Transformative Power of Inclusion. So let's just get started. Anne, in a few sentences, how would you define what it means to lead bigger?
Thank you. Thanks, Victoria, and thank you for having me, and thanks for all the great work that Asia Society does. So leading bigger is simply this. It means widening your perspective by including everyone to have greater performance and a bigger impact. And that's all it is, quite simply. It's really all about inclusion.
Fantastic. And so most of this book is really focused on specifically speaking to leaders. Mm-hmm. And so in your many years of experience, what would you say is the leadership skill that offers the highest return on investment?
Yeah, so there's been much written about different characteristics of great leaders: character, competence, courage, conviction, competence. But what I would say is just one of the key attributes of a great leader that I have found is really interpersonal flexibility, the ability to relate to others, because ultimately leadership is about people, right? Yeah. I mean, leadership is about rallying, aligning a group of people to go do something, right? And to get something done, to advance progress in whatever meaningful ways. And so in order to do that, you've got to, as a leader, be able to be flexible, to meet people and connect with people where they are, both from an individual perspective, but also as it relates to groups of people as well.
Yeah, it's really helpful to hear. And can you give me an example, maybe in the book or from your personal experience, where you saw the dynamic between like dealing with someone in an individual basis versus dealing with a group, and how you had to flex between those two?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually opened the book with a story about my first, what I would call traditionally big leadership role, no pun intended, where I was responsible for hundreds of people across multiple locations. And in that role, I realized, and I was in a customer service role, so we were customer facing, 7x24 by 365.
Wow.
Lots of immense pressure in the role, because typically customers don't call you when things are great, right? So true. We were on the end of complaints and issues that they were facing. So there was that sort of stress on the role. So what I found was, in my need to paint a picture of vision and purpose and encourage and ideally inspire my team to do well, I had to get to know them as individuals, which meant that I needed to connect with them and understand the stressors of what they had gone through and the stressors of day-to-day, but then also relate to them and communicate with them in a way that aligned them together and didn't have them competing against each other, but really looking at each other as comrades and as peers and trusted colleagues, right? With a willingness to build a culture where people could learn from each other, learn from mistakes, right? And move forward, because there was nothing more important than satisfying our customers. And the way to do that is by ensuring that your employees are actually satisfied.
Yeah, that's true. And kind of going into that idea of employee satisfaction, so there are so many concrete examples of bigger leadership throughout your book, but it's also an unfortunate reality that this kind of leadership is rare, and toxic work environments are pretty common. You talk about that a bit in the book. So what do you think are some of the biggest hurdles that prevent people from becoming bigger leaders? And how can someone who's interested in being a bigger leader thrive, or at least survive, when they're in a toxic environment?
Yeah, Victoria, thank you for the question. And I think the topic of toxic workplaces and toxic work environments is one that has become pretty commonplace, I think, especially after the pandemic, when the nature of work itself has changed. What I would say is, I don't know that I would assert that bigger leaders are rare, but certainly I would say, and this is also the reason why I wrote the book, is that we have a need for more bigger leaders. We have a need for more inclusive leadership to ensure that everybody is included and everybody feels that they belong and they connect to the work at hand. To answer your question about how do bigger leaders survive and ultimately thrive and navigate a toxic environment, some of the barriers that exist are, of course, small leadership behaviors, right? If you happen to work for someone or an environment where trust is very low, or there's a lot of micromanagement, where there might be an immense amount of stress and burnout because boundaries are not being respected, whether that's boundaries between home and work or otherwise, right? So what bigger leaders can do is, first of all, they need to make sure that they take care of themselves. When we think about safety and the idea of safety, we're very familiar with the notion of physical safety in the workplace, right? But what has really emerged is that a bigger leader's responsibility is to ensure the psychological safety of their people as well. So an environment where they can feel free to speak up and be themselves and contribute in the most meaningful ways. If you're a bigger leader in a toxic environment where that environment does not exist, you must work to create it for your teams, right? I mean, that is your responsibility so that you and your team can strive to thrive as much as you possibly can. But in order to do so, you have to take care of yourself, right? And if you are not well, whether it's physically, emotionally, or mentally, you cannot take care of others, right? And so I think the growing emphasis that we see on health and well-being is one that is incredibly emergent and will become just even more important as we evolve. Then what leaders need to do in those toxic environments is, if they choose to stay in those environments, they should do their very, very best to try to create change, right? And work with the people, the sources of where that toxicity may come from, and learn to work inclusively with those people to try to understand the nature of those behaviors and see if they can positively influence them, right?
Sounds like almost like lending them empathy rather than contempt,
Absolutely.
even if they're creating difficult situations.
Absolutely. And I'll tie back to one of your first questions about the leadership trait that's most critical. That's where your interpersonal flexibility comes in, right? Is that you have, right, if you're truly an inclusive leader, you have the ability to include everyone, to connect with everyone, especially those who are different than you, especially those who may lead in a different way, right? Including those who you may or others may characterize as toxic.
Yeah, that's fair. So to go in a slightly different direction, so a common theme we see in Asia Society's global talent initiatives is the need to invest in programming that addresses how to unlock the untapped leadership potential of specific groups in a company. So I'm thinking specifically women and, in our work, Asian professionals. Why do you think these groups are often overlooked for leadership positions that they're absolutely qualified for?
Yeah.
What actionable solutions can a company implement to address bias and ensure that they're retaining and promoting best talent?
Yeah. It's a very important, multifaceted question there. So first of all, let me say that we need to resist the urge to label people and put them in binary categories. You're a woman or you're not. You're Asian or you're not. You're Black or you're not, right? Each of us have an unlimited set of attributes, right, which include our gender and our race. All different sort of facets, what I call in the book, dimensionality to who we are.
Right, the things that we are born with and then the skills we develop.
Right, and the attributes that we may acquire, right, like our personality type or the things that we watch, or listen to, right? Media also influences us heavily, too, in terms of the development of those attributes.
Very true.
So in terms of the barriers that I see, right, I think what you're pointing out and what Asia Society has, been a part of in terms of continuing to drive progress in your global talent efforts is the fact that if you're different, right, than whatever the norm is or was, it is more difficult. And it can be more difficult, right? Not that it's impossible to progress or be considered the best, but there's no question that if you're different and if you're more different, it can be harder, right? Now, why does that exist? To your point, biases exist, right? To be human is to have bias, right? Biases are just simply a condition of being human and part of the neuroscience of how our brain works. It is normal to have bias. What we need to do a better job of, and this is what companies can do a better job of, is not only tackle and help people tackle the biases within themselves, right? And this is not to say you eliminate bias, but you can surface them and reframe them so that you can lead through them, right? We all have, at the highest level, two different kinds of bias, implicit and explicit, conscious and unconscious. So to raise that unconscious bias, right? And I'll use one example that I'm sure many of my Asian colleagues have run into. Oh, Asians are all good at math, but we're not great leaders. We're great workers, but we're not great leaders, right? That is a complete stereotype and a predominant bias that I've experienced throughout my career. Both of those, right? Both of those significant biases. What we can do is to not only address it within each of the individuals, but we have to also address it in the system. And I think this is an area which many companies overlook, right? They tend to program the people, right? As if to say, well, you know what, Anne, one of the reasons why Asians aren't viewed as leaders is that y'all can't communicate very well, right? Or that you don't demonstrate confidence in a way that gives you presence as an executive, right? Those kinds of statements are reflections of biases which exist that say leadership looks and sounds a certain way, when we very well know throughout human history that leadership is a choice. It is a set of behaviors and actions. It has no gender, race, age, or anything, right? Leadership is something that occurs when you can rally and inspire people towards some common goal. So I think organizations have to do a better job, not just focusing on those demographics, those groups of people who may not be progressing as much as they should, right? Especially if the evolution of the market says that you need to tap into those pools of talent. Otherwise, you're going to be left behind. They have to also inspect and understand the systems of decision-making, right? So that's processes, policies, who's making a decision about what, right? And one advice that I give every company is, especially when it comes to people decisions, promotions, hiring, firing of people, you've got to make sure that decision process isn't left to one person. Because when it is, you're subject to that one person's set of biases, and it would be impossible to expect that one person to not be swayed by them, especially if things are super busy or super stressed. Right. One example I'll give you is that one of the programs that I'm most proud of that I championed at AT&T was a Woman of Color initiative that was intended to help the company really better understand women of color as a cohort, right? We were doing things in the Black community, in the Latina community, in the Asian community, but there was not a lot done across the group. And with just simple facts like by the year 2060, minority women will become the majority of women in the United States, I felt there was an opportunity to better understand this demographic, both in terms of market opportunity, but also from a talent standpoint.
100%.
Right? So we built a program that was not just for the women. We actually included their supervisors in the program, right? Because that's part of the system. That's part of the process of evaluation, performance, coaching, and development. And I'm just super proud of that effort. But that's one example of how it's not just the program that focuses on the groups of people to help them. It's also to help others who form that system, who form those practices and policies, because all of it needs to transform if, in fact, you want to transform your workforce and the way that you do work.
100%. In fact, one of the structures of the Global Talent Speaker Series and our Global Talent Initiatives as a whole is talking to both sides of that community. Yes. The people who are allies, the people who make key decisions, the people who are in management, who may or may not align with or identify with, the groups of workers or professionals that are maybe overlooked in some of these key decisions. So we'll talk a little bit. You'll see on our website. There's a link to in the show notes a little bit more about the programs that we offer. But yes, very much to that point. If you're just speaking to the choir over and over again, you're not necessarily going to enact change as rapidly as you probably would have hoped. Right,
or systemically. Right?
Or systemically, yeah.
Right, and I love the fact that Asia Society does that because in essence, what you're doing is leading bigger, right? You're actually, that's what leading bigger is, to go back to the definition. Yeah. It's widening your perspective, including everyone to have greater impact, greater performance, right? Yeah. And so everyone means everyone, right? And it is, we can admit that it's harder to relate when we don't have that experience ourselves, right? Which is why inclusive leadership, bigger leadership is an imperative for all leaders today and all leaders tomorrow.
Fantastic. So now to a bit of a tricky question, but I know it's on anyone who's in the space of inclusivity and inclusive leadership. It's on their mind. It's been on their mind. over the past 2 years, there's been a growing backlash from individuals and companies against, and I want to emphasize, what they perceive to be D&I initiatives.
Yes.
So you eloquently wrote on the back of the back jacket, actually, that the phrase has become overly politicized and narrowly defined. So companies have been, on one side, companies have been accused of chasing trends or leveraging inclusion purely for PR or marketing purposes. And conversely, we have consumers who've launched boycotts against companies and their D&I initiatives. I mean, even most recently, as of like this August, when we think about what happened with Harley Davidson on social media channels. So in your view, what are these companies and individuals getting wrong about D&I? And in the same vein, what advice would you offer to leaders at these companies who are currently facing or fearing a boycott or legal challenge?
So Victoria, I get this question a lot, as you might imagine, right? You know, did you write this book exactly for this timing? And it was not intentional, but certainly my hope was for the book to be both timely and timeless, which this is extremely timely, right? This discussion. So let me first confess that I am not a fan of the DEI acronym. And the reason why I'm not a fan of the acronym is that it oversimplifies three very important yet separate imperatives: diversity, which just is a fact. I don't know why you're debating. It just is a fact. The world's becoming more diverse. Equity, which is about fairness. You can debate that. Or inclusion. Right? Inclusion requires action, and this is why I wrote a book about inclusive leadership. What people get wrong about what DEI is, but it really is not, is that it has now been sort of relegated and misperceived as issues of representation for gender and race. And that is it, right? And the assumption is, by those who are concerned about it, is that it's representation at all costs. When I don't think that I've ever seen anything in my vast 3 decades career of leadership that says it's representation above skills, it's representation above merit, it's representation above excellence and intelligence and the ability to do the job great, right? What it is about is widening your perspective, right? You know, by definition, all of us, with the pace of change and the fact that the world is so much more interconnected, we know we have to widen our perspectives all the time, right? That's how we stay ahead of the game. That's how we focus on growth. That's how we focus on innovation. And so issues of representation solely for gender and race are an element of inclusion. They are by no means the whole picture, right? Which is really what my book is intended to address. So, to your comment about what should leaders do, right? So now what should leaders do? Now that we know what it is not, but yet it is perceived as that, which is causing some of the issue of what we're seeing, and I will not comment on the merits of each of those companies making a decision. Those leaders made the decision because they thought it was in the best interest of their stakeholders, right? What I would say to every leader who may be struggling with this or thinking about how do I handle this for my group or my organization or my company is to harken back to actually where I start my book, which is about your work. What is the purpose of your work? What is the value system that underlies your business and your team, right? And if that purpose and those values require you to embrace a diverse marketplace for future diverse talent sets, a diverse marketplace for expansion for future markets and future customers, if you want to include as many voices as possible and as many perspectives as possible in your business, then this becomes part of your culture. It becomes part of your leadership DNA and your cultural DNA of the company. You just have to make sure that anything you comment on is aligned with your purpose and your values. Now, most importantly, right, every leader has a set of stakeholders, right, that we strive to serve, whether it's our customers, our employees, our investors or shareholders, or the communities in which we live and work and play. And there's no question, we have to make choices about stakeholders, right, and priorities about stakeholders. All stakeholders have different views of what it means for you to be successful. You have to decide which one of those stakeholders you have to prioritize as it relates to some of these difficult decisions, right? And so that to me is your North Star. That's the guiding light of when you decide whether you should say something, whether you should do something, you've just got to stay true to your purpose, your values, and have a clear view of your stakeholders and how they view your performance to be, right?
So kind of in that same vein, because we touched on this question being like a misunderstanding.
Yes.
And so I would love to know, like, and this is maybe a twofold question, why do you think it's been so misunderstood? And maybe that also speaks to leadership in some ways.
Yep.
Why has it been so misunderstood? And is there also responsibility from leadership, not just to, prioritize their stakeholders? Because what if their stakeholders are deeply misinformed?
Yeah.
So what would you say to that?
Well, I would say that, so why the misunderstanding and what is the role of bigger leaders? The role of bigger leaders is to address it, right? So you would never say, well, let's just use me as an example, right? My bio as an example, right? Yes, I was the first woman of color CEO in AT&T's history. I was the first woman to hold the role, but that's just happenstance, quite frankly, right? That's not what motivated me or what got me to that place in my career.
Right.
It was the things that I did, it was my qualifications, it was the outcomes and the deliverables that I had that were extended over a period of decades to achieve that role, that CEO role at AT&T of AT&T Business, right? Running a $35 billion business. So you spend time there, not necessarily with, oh, well, she was the first this or first that, right? So I think we as leaders, we absolutely have to do a better job at explaining and talking about why if somebody is chosen for a role, the merits of that, not that they were the first or the last or the only, that may very well be a fact, but that is not the driver for why that person
fact,
was.
Not a driver.
Right. I mean, it's a fact, right? It's kind of like your inherent attributes, right? Yeah, that's inherently true. Did I navigate my career in a way that was the desired outcome? Not in any way, shape, or form, right? I navigated my career with this idea of leading bigger, of having as much impact as I could possibly have, right? With being Asian, I can run into the stereotype. Leaning into having better and better performance, right? Because I wanted that for myself. I wanted that for others that I worked around, right? And that's what drove me, was that impact and that doing the right thing for more and more people. It was never because I wanted to be the first of anything, quite frankly. In fact, when I was told that, I didn't even know it, okay, until it happened. That's how sort of oblivious to that I was. So I do think that bigger leaders need to do that. I think all of us can do that. Now, I do think there's some introspection to your point about the misunderstanding. Organizations and leaders also have to take stock in their practices, right? Maybe some of them are, in fact, just behaving performatively. This is not maybe deeply ingrained in the culture of their organization, and maybe they were just doing it for optics or the reports or whatnot, right? And I have no doubt that that's probably true out there, but ultimately your choice is one of, do you decide to lead small or do you decide to be a bigger leader?
Well said. And so I know we've been asking you about advice for leaders currently in their roles, and I'm sure many people will take a lot of gems out of this conversation. For the next generation, is there a piece of advice you would share from the book to address this next generation of inclusive leaders? You do talk a lot about generational differences.
Yes.
What would that piece of advice be?
So you're asking me my advice for the younger the emerging workforce? As opposed
I'm
to
a millennial, but we got Gen Z, we got Gen Alpha coming up.
That's right.
What would you say to them?
Okay, this is super easy because I have 2 Gen Z daughters.
I give them advice all the time.
I know. Whether they listen is a totally different story because who listens to their Asian mother, right? Yeah. So the advice I would give to the emerging workforce, right, and the younger workforce are a couple-fold. One is, there are opportunities for learning everywhere. Be a lifelong learner, right? Every opportunity is an opportunity for growth and for learning. I do not believe there's such a thing as failure. There's only success in learning. And so when you approach your life and your career that way, you just keep going, right? And you just keep getting better. So that's one thing. Another one that I would say to these younger and emerging leaders is that embrace your authenticity, right? It took me a really long time. I don't know about you, Victoria, but it took me a little while in the early parts of my career to really get comfortable, right? And ask for help, because up until the time you enter the workforce, you're largely an individual contributor doing your own thing, right? So all of a sudden you're thrown into an environment where it is not clear how you get that 100 or A+ or 105, again, right? You know, right? Right. So, right. Yeah, rolling into the Asian stereotype again. But, you all of a sudden you're in the workforce, and there's all these other factors that contribute into how you are perceived and how you are viewed, right? And these are all things that you will only learn if you lean on others. So that second piece of advice would be about really leaning into relationships and connections, not only to learn from them, but also to be in service of others, right? This is something that I learned from my parents, right? They are first generation Americans, so they immigrated to the US from Taiwan. So they came here with almost nothing, right? And in pursuit of the very, classic American dream. I've always been taught to do well for others, right? To be in service of others. And that ultimately is what Leading Bigger is about, right? It is about serving others. It is about including others. It is about including everyone so that you all can have greater performance and the biggest impact you possibly can have. So that would be the other one. And then the other piece, I'll just throw one more in there.
Yeah,
as I think about my daughters, is to be a little patient, right? A lot of your growth comes through experience, right? And one of the things that I've started to see, I'm not going to say that this is a unilateral thing that I'm seeing, but I've seen enough of it that I'm going to say something right now about it. And that is maybe a little bit of a lack of patience, right? If this isn't working out to perfection, the way that you were dreaming it to be, give it a little time, right? Give yourself enough time to make a conscious decision of, I'm gonna stick this out for a year, I'm gonna learn from it, then I'm gonna move on, right? Because I would argue doing something for 3 months or 6 months, less than a year, it's hard, right? Now, I'm not saying if you're in a toxic environment and your health is suffering, don't get out, right? You have to take care of yourself. But if it's just simply because you're uncomfortable just means you're growing. Right? Being comfortable means you stagnate. Right?
So how do we develop that grit? Maybe
that's right. How do you build resilience? How do you build more agility and interpersonal flexibility that starts teaching you through experience how to deal with different kinds of situations, different kinds of people, difficult conversations? There's no way that you learn those things without doing it, and that requires quite a bit of patience in addition to that interpersonal flexibility that we've talked about.
Risk, ability to be comfortable with uncomfortable situations. I can think of so many personal examples. And that's definitely where the growth comes when you do something you're scared of.
Totally.
And you stick with it.
Yes.
100%. Okay, I have one last question for you, and it's a fun one.
Okay, fun. Fun is good. So this whole thing has been fun.
It'll be even more fun. So I learned from the book that you're a huge Foo Fighters fan.
I am.
And rightfully so.
Yes.
They're incredible.
They are. Best live show ever.
I'm sad I have never seen one, but
it must be on your bucket list.
I'll add it before it's too late. But what is your favorite Foo Fighters song and why?
Okay, I have two. Is that okay? Okay, I have two. So one that most people may not, except for the huge fans, probably have not heard of is called Stranger Things. It's kind of a very melancholy kind of song, very reflective. The reason why I love it is that, first of all, it's beautiful. It's poignant. But I think he wrote it from the context of, a lost relationship, right? And I think that's something we can all relate to, whether it was a romantic relationship or another relationship in our life that just dissipated, a friendship or otherwise, right? We each have seasons in our life, people that were once in our life that were meaningful to us that are no longer. And so I just love that song. And I also think that stranger things have happened, period, right? So that's just the way life is. My sort of go-to high energy, super positive song from them is Learn to Fly. And I love the lyrics. I love the energy behind the music. And it's just so hopeful in a way. And for me, it's all about, we're constantly learning to fly, right? Leading Bigger is about learning to fly in so many different ways. And it's about learning to fly by learning from others, right? By those widened perspectives that are different than yours, right? So Learning to Fly is always kind of my go-to workout song. If I'm feeling down, I just put that thing on and it's the best. But Foo Fighters all the way. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to wrap up today. So thank you so much, Anne, for your time. The book is Lead Bigger. It is available starting tomorrow, September 10th, I believe. And, Anne, thank you so much for so graciously coming in today to speak about your many years of expertise, especially to our audience who were really eager to hearing what you have to say. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you, and I look forward to leading bigger with you and everyone else out there.